coming to Austin first week of September. So, all right, it's the top of the hour. I'm sure more people will come in. Oh, hey, Mary from San Diego. Very cool. Great to see you. It's been a while. We'll go ahead and get started. I think we have enough to go ahead and get started. So welcome to today's webinar, Maximizing Value from Design Controls, Strategies for Medical Device Companies. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'll be the moderator for today. I'm the head of industry education, head of industry and education and insights at Greenlight Guru. I still don't really fully, I guess my title is too much of a mouthful for me, but anyway, during today's session, we invite you to actively participate. Many of you already are, really appreciate that. Use the chat tab on the right to connect with fellow attendees, say hi to each other, and connect with people who are from your locale. Love to see that. But there's another section that's the Q&A. That Q&A tab is meant to ask questions directly to the presenter. We'll use those Q&As or those questions in the Q&A to ask the questions during the Q&A section. Even if you don't have a question that you want to ask, go ahead and check out the Q&A throughout the presentation, because someone else may have asked a question that's relevant to you, and you can vote on that question. We'll try to prioritize the ones that are most relevant to the audience. So the highest voted questions, I'll try to prioritize those. We will be sending the full recording and presentation slides to all registrants after the live event, so watch your inbox for that follow-up email. At Greenlight Guru, our mission is to improve the quality of life through our work in the medtech industry, which is likely a shared goal of many of you here today. We like to host these free webinars to share those valuable insights, learn from top industry experts, and showcase our industry-leading solutions. Our software is designed to help medtech companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. That's our goal. Our medtech suite includes software solutions for product development, quality management, and clinical data management, which are all tailored specifically for the medical device industry. So if you're interested in joining over 1,100 leading medtech companies that trust Greenlight Guru, feel free to visit www.greenlight.guru for your personalized demo after today's webinar. Now, to introduce today's presenter, Eric Bash is an ASQ certified quality engineer and medical device auditor. He's further an INCOSE, INCOSE certified systems and engineering professional. Eric holds a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering and a master's degree in systems engineering, both from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He leads the design and development quality engineering team at Galero and has worked in quality for almost 15 years in both naval nuclear power and medical device development and manufacture. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Eric for today's featured presentation. Take it away.
Thank you. So yeah, I'll just go ahead and introduce Galero real fast, who I'm with. So Galero is a leading company in the field of medical device development and manufacturing. Galero works with some of the most trusted brands in the world to design innovative medical devices, drug delivery systems, and combination products that improve the quality of life for patients and healthcare providers. Galero has extensive experience in various therapeutic areas such as cardiology, neurology, oncology, and diabetes. Galero also offers regulatory, quality, and engineering services to support its clients throughout the product lifecycle. I'm actually going to hop off camera here just so I can focus on giving you the best presentation possible. So we'll continue with just my voice. Okay. We're going to be going through design controls today and how you can get value out of activities that you need to conduct for regulatory compliance anyways. By conducting these activities at appropriate points and in the right ways throughout our development process, we can improve customer satisfaction, patient safety, and adherence to timeline and budget. These are the elements of design control listed in 21 CFR 820 and ISO 13485. As you can see, they are largely identical. The only real difference is that ISO 13485 refers to design and development files, where 21 CFR 820 refers to a design history file. I'll be using the term design history file throughout this presentation, but I'm intending to cover both of these items. We'll walk through what each of these bullets mean later in the presentation. Taking a step back, let's look at some cross-industry best practices for design processes. These are the elements listed in the Certified Quality Engineer Handbook from ASQ in conducting a design process. You'll notice that there's quite a bit of overlap with the elements called for in 21 CFR 820 and ISO 13485. Similarly, NCOSE, the International Council on Systems Engineering, has their own set of processes for conducting design work. You'll again see that these largely overlap with the elements called for in 21 CFR 820 and ISO 13485. This is to show that the items called for in regulation aren't just there because of some burden placed on medical device manufacturers, and in fact, align with best practices across industry for safe and effective design processes. Let's take a moment to zero in on the concept of change control. You'll notice that change control is listed as an element of design control. Design control encompasses many more elements than just change control. Don't be afraid to enter design controls just because you think you suddenly need to apply full change controls. This is a common misconception that leads teams to delay entering design control until well after doing so would be appropriate. We'll talk about timing and use of change control in design later in the presentation. Now that we've defined what design controls are, let's take a look at how they can add value. We're going to step through a couple of case studies where design controls were not properly applied and examine the repercussions of not doing so. The Therac 25 was a device for radiation treatment of certain cancers. This device was almost solely responsible for the generation of IEC 62304 for medical device software development. Failing to adhere to design controls led to poor software and system engineering practices that directly led to patient injury and death, even following multiple field actions to attempt to address this issue. To give an idea of the scale of the problem, one patient intended to receive 86 rads, instead received between 8,000 and 10,000 rads. That's 80 to 100 gray for our SI friends. So what went wrong? The team adapted the design from previous models which did not have comprehensive design history files. In previous models, hardware interlocks had prevented software errors from causing massive radiation overdoses. Those interlocks were removed in the Therac 25 with no analysis of the impact of this change. The interlocks were removed because customers were complaining of them frequently tripping, causing user nuisance. I'm going to pause and just let us think through that logically for a moment. We're removing the interlocks because they're tripping too often. The manufacturer believed that because they thus far had a strong safety record, that no new significant risks were introduced with the Therac 25 model. Failure to conduct a design review led to failure to catch the impact of the removal of the interlocks, as well as failure to identify poor coding practices, such as failing to sanitize and validate user input variables. Specifications and documentation were viewed as an afterthought throughout the design process in the Therac 25, as well as in the previous models, leading to late documentation with limited coverage that was not used to assess and inform the design process. Why was this the case? Well, complacency, as mentioned earlier, played a big part. But also, software resources were not adequately planned for, and the manufacturer prioritized functionality to the exclusion of design control activities with the resources available. It's not just the medical device industry which struggles with effective use of design controls. Let's take a look at a cross-industry example, the Northrop Grumman RQ-4 Global Hawk. This was a surveillance drone project that faced significant cost overruns, both in design and per unit, and ultimately failed to deliver on the mission provided. What happened here? Planning was perfunctory at best and failed to address key concerns such as resourcing, verification, and validation in the development lifecycle. Software development efforts were underestimated, which, as you may have noticed from the earlier case study, is a trend in projects involving software. Ultimately, due to failure to plan and failure to conduct design reviews to include testing efforts, were insufficient to provide full coverage of all design inputs. This was confounded by significant changes to fundamental design inputs late in the design process, such as a 50% increase in required payload capacity. Because the project was under-resourced, using development life cycles inappropriately, and facing significant changes throughout the design process, as is typical, the first thing to go were design control elements, so like documentation, architecture, and modeling. These were all slapped together towards the end of the project as a checkbox compliance activity instead of using them to inform the design process. What patterns can we identify from the previous two case studies? Inadequate planning led to inadequate resourcing in both the TheraAct 25 and the RQ4 Global Hawk. Under resource, budget, and schedule constraints, design reviews were neglected and documentation became an afterthought pushed to the end of development. If this sounds like any of your current projects, it might be time to pause and consider if those projects might end up like either of these case studies if you stay your current course. Okay, so we've established that design controls are important, but when should we use them? Many manufacturers are concerned that imposing design controls too early will lead to excessive costs and wasted time, and they'd be right in some circumstances. Let's explore when to apply and when not to apply design controls to better define that decision space so that we can enter design controls with intentionality. There are three spaces that generally fall into research, where it would be too early to apply design controls. These are ideation, technology, and portfolio. In ideation, we're assessing the feasibility of a concept to meet a user need. This might, for example, be conducting user studies with early prototypes or mock-ups to determine if the chosen design concept is capable of meeting the identified user need. Next, technology research focuses on creating and optimizing subassemblies, subsystems, and subroutines prior to full-scale device development. These activities generally center around assessing various geometries or methodologies for performing some task within the system and finding what configuration works best for performing that task. This is done prior to and outside of full-scale device development. Lastly, portfolio activities are focused on determining if a market exists for a device. Here again, prototypes or mock-ups may be used in user studies to see if customers are even interested in purchasing something like the conceptual design prior to entering full-scale development. In the previous slide, we covered research. Once you've moved beyond research, you're in product development, and it's time to start implementing design controls. You'll know you're in product development if your project team is making an effort to realize a product for delivery to market. However, there is no clear-cut rule on when to enter design controls. You have to make a judgment call based on the work being performed and the guidance given in your quality management system. Thinking back to our case studies, planning, documentation, requirements generation, risk management, and other design control activities are frequently the first things to be cut when facing resource, budget, or schedule constraints. Why? These activities are frequently perceived as non-value add and overly burdensome to conduct during design activities. And why is that? Well, if you're constantly pushing these activities to the very end of your process, then yes, they'll be non-value add and require significant work to go back and assess the design and fit the documentation to it. It doesn't have to be this way. If embracing design control activities early with the mindset that they are being employed specifically to add value and not to just check a box for regulatory compliance, you'll find that the actual design work becomes easier, and you can identify earlier if you may have a budget or schedule miss. Engineers, like artists, have a tendency to want to tinker and play whack-a-mole with design problems as they arise. Resist this urge. We can take a methodical and disciplined approach for smooth product development. I mentioned cost savings earlier. This slide is meant to help illustrate how that happens. By doing things correctly the first time and catching it early when we don't, we can spend significantly less time and money in identifying and resolving issues. Once you've cut steel tooling, for example, it becomes very costly to fix a problem caused by the device geometry, and most workarounds tend to be kludges. Similarly, if wanting to do your risk activities late in the design process, the design may be too far along to add risk mitigations identified through this process, making it difficult to claim risk has been reduced as far as possible as required in the BSEN ISO 14971. In the worst case, your issues aren't found until your product reaches the field, and assuming that no one is seriously injured or worse, a recall is still a very costly activity to perform and impugns the effectiveness of your design control processes. So, great, design controls are important, and we have an idea of when to implement them. But how do we do design controls in a way that adds value? Let's first take a look at planning. Here are the elements of a plan per ISO 13485. Thinking back to the case studies, you might see how many of these elements were missed in the design processes of both systems. By conducting planning in a way that hits all of the required elements of ISO 13485, something we should be doing anyways, at the right time in our development process, we can head off many of the issues that plagued the Therac 25 and the RQ4. Taking a step back again, let's look at cross-industry guidance on what constitutes a plan. NCOSI here covers very similar elements to those identified in ISO 13485. Lifecycle, responsibilities and authorities, and resourcing are all shared with ISO 13485. Elements unique to the NCOSI planning guidance are key technical objectives, what constitutes a successful design, project assumptions and constraints, what are the bounds of the planning activity itself, and system boundaries and scope, what is in scope versus out of scope for the system development. NCOSI highlights that a plan need not be perfect, and the best practice is to update the plan throughout the project. When conducting your planning, make use of management reserve for both schedule and budget. Base the amount of management reserve needed on the level of uncertainty identified in your planning processes. Do not simply allocate time to work packages and assume that all work packages will come in on time and on budget. When doing so, budget or schedule inevitably slip, and design control practices are often the first things sacrificed in an attempt to make either of these up. Typically, this just compounds the problem and causes a spiral in failing to meet all three of budget, schedule, and quality objectives. Once you get into development, the activity is largely defining your inputs and then transforming these into outputs. This diagram, sourced from the Systems Engineering Body of Knowledge Wiki, provides a high-level overview of this process. You start by identifying your need statements. I recommend splitting these out into user needs and other stakeholder needs so that user needs can be treated with special deference required by 21 CFR 820. Other stakeholder needs include items such as standards compliance and COGS targets, which need not be validated in the same way as your true user needs. From your set of needs, you decompose these into your design inputs, also called system requirements or any number of other terms. These are largely functional descriptions of what the device does to meet the need statements. Architecture then bridges your design inputs and your design outputs, and we'll cover what that means here in a second. Your design outputs are your work instructions, prints, detailed software design documentation, and other elements which make up your device master record. Following all of this, you should have system elements which, when integrated, satisfy your need statements. You'll notice that this diagram shows feedback paths in addition to directing transformation by decomposition. Depending on your chosen development lifecycle, it is normal, expected, and even advantageous to refine earlier steps in the requirements chain based upon lessons learned lower down the stack. Okay, so architecture. I left you hanging back on the previous slide on defining what exactly this was. It's not explicitly called for in 21 CFR 820 or ISO 13485. So what is it? Architecture bridges your design inputs and your design outputs. There is no one definition for what architecture is, and if I tried to show you all of the relevant definitions that I could find, it would just likely add confusion. Let's instead focus on what is typical and how it's used. Architecture generally consists of some form of conceptual model of your product. In going through the process of defining this model alone, many improvements to the design can often be identified. Further, the model can be challenged in your design review process to ensure alignment across the team and to aid in identification of further design problems prior to building or testing anything. If you are following some form of iterative or hybrid design process per your design and development plan, and haven't chosen strict adherence to waterfall, architecture need not be fully developed prior to determining design outputs. Best practice, however, is to keep architecture concurrent with developed design outputs. Well, what does a model look like? A model generally consists of both structural and behavioral descriptions or views of your design. The system modeling language, SysML, is one tool available for developing such a model. This diagram shows an example state machine describing the operation of an insulin infusion pump. This model shows behavior from startup, steady state behaviors, what the system does when control limits are exceeded, and the handling of various interrupts. This model can be compared against design inputs to ensure design input behaviors are captured in the architecture, and that realized system elements, such as physical user interface and software units, can be compared against this architecture as well to ensure alignment in design. By straddling inputs and outputs like this, architecture facilitates turning design inputs into design outputs in a methodical and consistent way. So this example is meant to be a illustration of what a structural view might look like. And this is of the same insulin infusion pump. Here, the elements which are in scope versus out of scope for system development are represented, as are their interactions with each other. Allocations are made as to what elements belong to what subsystem and signals. And you can see some level of definition for the establishment of boundaries. You can see, for example, that the cell phone app is allowed to read data from the pump, but is not allowed to send commands, and that is reserved for the dedicated remote control accessory. I keep talking about design review, but what is a design review? ISO 13485 says that a design review is for evaluating the ability of the design to meet requirements and to identify and propose necessary actions. That's a little academic, so let's break it down. Conduct design reviews early and often to review decomposition of requirements, chosen architectures, and early testing data to evaluate how well the design is meeting the requirements. Where this looks to be in question, get ahead of it by making adjustments early. Let's discuss what not to do regarding design review, and then we'll get into best practices. A very common pitfall, and a simple one, is simply failing to schedule design review. Many teams will have a meeting called a design review towards the end of the project, but treating review as a checkbox activity in this way is doing your design teams a disservice. Next, lack of measurement. If you're not measuring anything, it's very hard to make decisions based on anything other than gut feel. Design review is a good opportunity to compare progress to schedule and evaluate if the project is appropriately resourced given the project schedule. Further, where testing data is available, use this to evaluate how well the design is meeting the requirements well prior to attempting your design verification testing so the device can be improved prior to that, as long as prior to moving to things like production tooling. My apologies. Something in time culture is the mindset that as long as we have something at the designated time in the schedule, that's good enough. Avoid this mindset and make sure that you're challenging the design against its requirements and not just that something exists. Your design reviews need teeth. If your design reviews identify problems, the team conducting the design review needs the authority to raise these issues and seek resolution. If all findings in design review will be ignored, the design review might as well not have happened. Lastly, baselining too early. Especially in the medical device industry, time to market is everything. However, it is important to avoid the impulse to lock design inputs prior to doing the necessary activities to ensure that these design inputs are correct. Don't lock inputs just because it's the designated time in the schedule to do so, if these inputs haven't been appropriately challenged and vetted. Baselining too early can result in significant foundational changes to inputs late in the design process, which is almost always a disaster for the system in question. Recall the RQ4. How do we do design review right then? Independent review is a required element of 21 CFR 820, and at least one member of the review team must not have direct responsibility for the design stage being reviewed. By selecting a knowledgeable, critical, independent reviewer, the design review is more likely to detect any issues with the product or design process. Peer reviews means grabbing specialists who are knowledgeable in the subject matter being reviewed, who may or may not be your designated independent reviewer. Specialist reviewers are specifically called out in 21 CFR 820 and ISO 13485. Accept uncertainty. Unless the design review is conducted at the very end of your design process, some or many things may not be known. Don't let this be a reason not to conduct design review. Identify what you don't know and make sure that project risk associated with these unknowns is appropriately controlled. This dovetails into project risk mitigation plans. In medical device, we are required to take a patient safety first focus to risk mitigation. Don't let this focus preclude conducting project risk assessment and mitigation. By assessing risk in our design processes, we can get ahead of any threats to budget or schedule before they cause problems and begin to pressure us into bad habits. Just-in-time baselining means delaying freezing of design inputs until high confidence is achieved that they are stable and waiting until the team is ready to move into establishing design outputs. Effective communication is a must in efficiently conducting design review. Approach design review with an agenda and ensure adequate time and space is given to address all agenda items. Design review must be transparent if it is to be effective. Don't attempt to disguise, omit, or hide bad news, and ensure that the review team has full visibility to all pertinent information. Concurrent management means taking the outputs of design review and using them to actively manage the project. Don't fall victim to helplessness mindset. Actively manage projects based on design review outputs. Lastly, review lessons learned. This means both to review lessons from similar projects that they've learned relevant to the stage under review, as well as to perform a post-mortem on any lessons learned during this design stage. In case there's any confusion on what the difference is between design verification and design validation, I'd like to quickly touch on it. Both of these tests are forms of acceptance testing, which is why they can sometimes be confused for one another. Verification is testing the device to ensure that the device functions as designed. Validation is working with users to ensure that the device meets all user needs. When developing your requirements, think what tests that they'll be associated with during acceptance testing to help frame the requirements around its ultimate acceptance criteria. Manufacturers employ statistical techniques with mixed success. There's a lot of bad practice and misunderstandings floating out there in this space. In general, make sure that any testing that you perform is statistically valid for any conclusions drawn, to include that all underlying assumptions for that statistical technique are met. Common pitfalls include using operating characteristic-based curves like AQL or C equals 0 for single lots when these methods only give average quality over many lots. Use of variable testing, but only accounting for confidence or reliability and not both. And use of variable testing that requires normal data when the underlying data is not normal. Once the product is designed, resist the temptation to throw it over the wall to manufacturing. Design transfer is an integral part of design controls, and failing to give design transfer adequate attention is akin to giving up just prior to the finish line at the end of the marathon. For smoothest results, conduct design transfer prior to conducting formal verification and validation activities, so production equivalence is easy to demonstrate. In general, you want to ensure that the device can be manufactured to specifications in a stable manner prior to going to market. This will generally include the performance of various process validation activities and the establishment of supplier controls. I mentioned production equivalence earlier, but what does that mean? The FDA gave sort of a definition of what constitutes production equivalence in the Federal Register, and this may be different from what you've seen claimed as production equivalence in industry. Specifically, the FDA is concerned that the following items must be equivalent to what would be used in commercial manufacturing. Personnel, to include competency and training. Specifications, such as drawing and material specifications. General production and quality system methods used in product realization, such as in-process inspections and supplier controls. Work instructions and other procedures, and any equipment used in the manufacturing process. The design history file, or technical file, of marketing the device in an ISO 13485 country is the repository of all things we've discussed so far in this presentation. If you've done a good job of documenting everything, This makes leveraging the design for a future design much easier and safer. Recall the Therac 25. Further, where issues do arise, the design history file is the first place to look when conducting root cause investigations. Also, when conducting changes to the design, these changes can be evaluated against the design history file for impact to ensure all concerns are adequately addressed. Change control must be implemented at some point in your development process, generally sometime after starting design controls but before commercialization. What does change control look like early in design? Consider the following questions associated with any change. Does the change invalidate any testing already conducted? Does the change impact production equivalents for anything used for design validation? Have all impacts of this change been identified and carried through to all necessary design inputs and design outputs? Has any material been reduced that needs to be dispositioned because of this change? Have any regulatory filings been made, which may then require update? If your system is more burdensome than this prior to completing development, this is more likely a lack of flexibility in your QMS than a burden imposed by adopting change control. That concludes the presentation, so we'll open it up to questions, and I'll go back to the camera here.
All right, thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Eric. I know you have a lot of experience in this, so it's hard to encapsulate it all into one presentation, but thank you so much for everything that you shared with us. We do have some questions that came in, but before we get to those, I want to remind the audience, feel free to use that Q&A section if you have any questions you'd like us to ask. Also, if you don't have any questions, go over anyway and upvote the questions that are most relevant to you so that we can make sure that we ask the ones that are most applicable to the audience. So D. Williams asked, how do you easily apply all of these requirements to a Class 1 exempt device, non-measuring, non-sterile, not a reusable surgical instrument that predates FDA requirements when you are ISO 13485 certified? So that's extremely specific, but maybe we can kind of break this down a little bit and start with the Class 1 exempt device and what your recommendations are about maybe a device that's exempt from design controls from an FDA standpoint.
Right. So I'm not a regulatory expert, so take some of this with a grain of salt. Class 1 devices that meet all of the criteria that you specified there are often exempt from design controls. And an area that teams sometimes get into trouble is that they will try to do this half in, half out with design controls, where they want to do a little bit of design control because they want to get a little bit of value out of it, but they don't want to do all of it because it's kind of burdensome. You want to avoid doing that. It's kind of either do it or don't. So if you're going to apply design controls, just do all of it and kind of tailor it real tight to what is actually adding value in your process. So biggest thing there, do it early enough that you are adding value. If you wait until the end, it's never going to add value. And just keep it really limited in scope for these very simple devices.
Okay. Great answer. Let me go ahead and go to the next one. So this one is from Nam Trin, if I'm saying your name correctly, and if not, I apologize. Is an independent reviewer still required in design reviews? And I'm assuming that's talking about QMSR. Yeah, do you want to speak to that?
So I have not reviewed the QMSR specifically. And 21 CFR 820, independent review is specifically called out as a requirement. So as long as we're still under 21 CFR 820, the answer is yes. If you're only marketing in an ISO 13485 country, you're never going to the US, then no, independent review is not called for in ISO 13485. It's still a best practice. I highly recommend it. Not required if only complying to 13485. And as for the QMSR, I'd have to take a look.
Yeah, I can go ahead and add to that too, because I have kind of gone through the QMSR pretty extensively. So you will need to have that independent review for an FDA device up until February 2nd, 2026. After that, it's no longer applied or required under QMSR. So yeah, I'll just throw that out there. Mm-hmm. Still best practice. I'll echo that. So Eric, you always want extra eyes. I would never complain about that. And that's actually a good question. So I'm just going to throw this out there as well, this follow-up question, which I don't have an answer for this necessarily. Sinead, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that name. Just a follow-up tag on, is independent review required for MDR and EU ISO 13485? I don't know about EU MDR, honestly.
Yeah, I know it's specifically not listed in 13485. So they omit the requirement for independent review in 13485. I'd have to dig into the MDR to see if it's in there.
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that. Go ahead and if someone wants to throw that out there in the chat, feel free to put that in the chat if you know yes or no, or what article that would be in to find it, because I always like the specificity if you can provide that. All right, going back to our regularly scheduled broadcasts and looking at the more the higher upvoted ones. Moritz, if I'm saying your name correctly again, apologies if not. Could you please clarify at which point change control is mandatory? In our point of view, it's after design inputs are established. Any thoughts there?
So no, there is no point at which change control is mandatory. There's kind of an art form of figuring out where you want to apply change control based on where you are in your development process. And so if there is any sort of mandatory, you must apply change control at this point, it's coming from your QMS. It's not coming from standards. It's not coming from regulation. You need to have change control that's able to address the points that I addressed back in the presentation. So if you have inputs and outputs established, you need to be able to assess if those have been impacted. If you've made material, you need to be able to figure out what you do with that material after the change. If it impacts your testing, your regulatory filings, all of that, you need to assess the impact of any change to that. So if you're getting to the point that those sorts of questions become valid and useful, you probably need to be in change control.
Okay. I'll add one additional question. Maybe you can provide some clarity, because I get asked this occasionally. Is the change control fulfilling the goal to fulfill the requirements of Part 820.40, the document controls as it relates to that product, or is there additional burden of change management that goes on from some other area?
Yeah, so I mean, you want to be able to show a design history in your design history file. That's why it's called design history file. So yes, once you establish design inputs and you've done what NCOSE calls baselining, that's really kind of where you would probably start change control. But if you haven't baselined yet, and a lot of that's going to be dependent on your particular life cycle that you've chosen. If you're in more of a hybrid or iterative life cycle, then you may not baseline as early as you would in a waterfall life cycle. And we've discussed that baselining too early, in fact, can even be problematic for your design process. So yeah, the goal is show that design history, and the way to do that formally is through change control.
Okay. Christopher Saylor asked the question, how do you tie together design controls for multiple devices, such as an IVD test and then a machine, to run a whole lot of that IVD test quickly?
I'm trying to understand the question. So is this around like different scopes of work?
Good question. It would, I'm trying to think how that, and Christopher, if you want to put some additional commentary in the chat, maybe we can come back to this in just a moment. If you want to ask, get a few more specifics around that. So let's just go to the next one for a moment. How many design reviews are required according to ISO 13485?
How many are required? One. Is doing one at the very end of your project a good idea? No. It's common for companies to have design stages or design phases, and to do a design review coupled with like a design stage, design phase review. That's certainly a way to do it, and a way that can add value. You don't have to do that. And even if you are using phases or stages, you can combine multiple phases or stages into a single review. Back to that class 1 example, that's a good example of where you might want to do things like combine review activities. There may not be a lot of value in having a specific design inputs review followed by a specific design outputs review for a very simple device.
Okay, no, that's good. And I'll throw one other thought out there too, because oftentimes we'll mix up project review and design review. Occasionally they can be misconstrued. There's a lot of overlap between a technical review and a project review, but yeah, it's a good answer. Okay, make sure I mark the correct one answered. John Minier, if I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, apologies, John, if not, asks, can an independent reviewer be assigned a future task such as post-market clinical follow-up after commercialization, or does that make that person a part of the team, therefore not independent? Maybe the real question is, what makes a independent reviewer independent?
Yeah, so the verbiage that's in 21 CFR 820 is that they cannot be directly responsible for the design stage under review. So if you want to get down to what is the definition provided by FDA for independence, it's that. So I would probably be a little bit more strict than that. And if the person has been further involved, like throughout the process, if not specifically in that design stage, maybe they are not the best choice for independent review. But the requirement is that they cannot be directly responsible for the stage you are reviewing.
Yeah, and one thing I'll throw out too, both from this and the number of design reviews you should have, is there's the letter of the law and there's the spirit of the law. And if you think about the spirit of the law, why is it there? It's really a business. There's a business reason behind it as well. You want an independent reviewer so that you will have a robust product, so that you will have a robust business. I mean, that's part of what it is. So we can't forget the practical side simply because we're trying to meet a regulatory requirement sometimes. So I think you said that. I'm just putting it in different words.
Yep.
Okay. Edward asked about engineering notebooks. It's a little bit nebulous of a question. No offense, Edward. I appreciate the question. I wonder if you could speak to this, because this is actually a thought I've had. Where do they come in, and what's the practicality, and what's the handling, the appropriate handling of engineering notebooks?
Yeah, so there's not a specific definition of what an engineering notebook is in like 21 CFR 820 or anything like that. What is common practice is that engineering notebooks are a way to formally document things like sketches and meeting notes and or meeting minutes, or if you want to put the raw data for some tests that you're performing, especially if those tests are more along the lines of engineering evaluation and not design verification. Those are all great things to put in controlled engineering notebooks that can exist as part of the design history file for that project.
Okay. What about, so Ryan asked, can you speak to aligning software and hardware development process across design controls, as they typically use different methodologies, agile versus waterfall?
Yeah. So AMI TIR 45 is a really good reference for how to do that. I can kind of speak to it a little bit, but if you want details, go look at that standard from AMI. So no one really ever does strict agile or strict waterfall, especially in the med device space. And pretty much everyone is doing hybrid, even if they don't think they're doing hybrid. And so what that typically means is that you're locking your design inputs and your planning, and then going into some sort of iteration cycles. And so those iteration cycles could be spiral, they can be agile, they can be scrum, whatever makes sense for you and your team. And you would discuss that in your design and development plan. And then following all of your iterations, and you think, hey, I've got a commercial product, great. Perform transfer, do your design verification validation, get it out to market. And so it's kind of a little bit of waterfall, then iterative, and then back to waterfall. I think you're on mute there, Edian.
I didn't know what I was going to say yet anyway, so that probably saved me. Christopher asked the question, how do you tie together design controls for multiple devices? Well, okay, so this is, we're coming back to this question just briefly, and I want to kind of rephrase it because I didn't see any additional commentary coming from Chris, but I want to rephrase it to a different situation. Suppose you have a device that you're developing, but you're also developing a kit. So you're developing the devices, but you're also developing the kit. It's all happening at the same time. I'm just using that as maybe an example. A scalpel is going to go in there and a few bones. What are your thoughts there?
So best practice is, if you know that's going to happen, make it all part of the same plan. Do it all at once, and therefore you can kind of combine a lot of activities, gain a lot of efficiencies that way. And you can make specific design choices for the scalpel, for whatever, to fit better in that kit when it comes to the kit design. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes we make a widget and you go, hey, it'd be really great if we put some lidocaine next to this or whatever. So to do that, you kind of have to go back and look at your design history file and make sure that it's adequate, complete, and everything else. And then you can leverage that and then adding that to whatever additional project you're doing. It's still a project. You still need to go through all of your design controls for your new project. But you can point to all of the things you previously did for the stuff that's going in there, or the stuff that is being reused in any way. And you don't necessarily have to re-execute that, except where there are interactions between your new scope of work or your new system boundaries and your previous system boundaries.
Okay. Great. All right. I appreciate you taking another stab at that one, at that question. Okay. Harsh asks, what are the steps we have to take after design control if we have to add or have some change in risk management?
Yeah, so it kind of comes down to, well, what risk management change are you making? It's always easier to make things tighter than it is to loosen up your risk management requirements. So if you, for example, showed that, hey, we estimated that we were going to have a 1 in 100 rate of failure in our design process because we wanted to be conservative and estimate high. But as we get into our field data, we're seeing that our complaints are really more like 1 in 10,000. And I want to tighten that down in my risk management file. Yeah, you can do that. You put it through change controls and you make sure that you've touched everything that risk file touches to ratchet that down. And then that's now your trip and your post-market process for that particular complaint that you've done that for, or that particular risk category, or wherever else it touches. Again, it's going to be largely determined by your change control process. And stuff like that is something you can do. If you add risk controls, again, your change control process is going to go, okay, well, what does that touch? What does that impact? Do I need to re-perform any testing? At minimum, you're going to have to do some sort of VOI and VOE for that risk control itself. But is there additional risks created by that risk control that need to get assessed? And has it changed the functionality of your device in any way? That functionality also needs to be retested. And again, that's what the change control process is there to assess.
Okay. And so speaking of change control process, there's a question here from Casey who asked, can you please discuss the separation of change control between document change control in terms of QMS documentation versus changes to the device? Is there terminology to distinguish these types of change control?
Not within the standard. However, I have seen companies do things like we'll have a document change request versus an engineering change request if they want to split out those activities. And a lot of this just gets down to implementation of how you do things specifically within your QMS. There are different considerations for I changed a QMS document versus I changed a project document versus I changed a print. And so however you want to control those things, it's kind of left up to you and your QMS.
Okay. So it's just, okay, very good. That's a question that I think maybe as a industry we've left a little bit confusing. So I appreciate you explaining that. Any advice or tips or tricks that you can share on doing retrospective building of the design history file?
Well, avoid it at all possible. You want to be building your design history file as you go for all the reasons that we just discussed. That said, you kind of have to go back through and act as though you're like kind of doing the project from scratch, except you already have this thing. And you're kind of reverse engineering it and redoing the design history file kind of as you go through that reverse engineering process. This will not be a value add activity in terms of is it making a better product. All it's really doing is just making sure that you have that design history file for either your next product, for changes to this product, and so forth.
Okay. Can you explain a little bit more about what baselining is? Sandra asked this question.
Yeah, that's an NCOSI term. So not a lot of people may have heard that if they're not in the systems engineering space. So baselining is kind of design freeze or locking of any sort of element. They use baselining separate from design freeze because design freeze means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Baselining is just saying we're going to take some element of inputs, not necessarily all of inputs. It could be some subset of inputs, and we're going to say that these are what we are designing to. And once you've done that, it's okay to then start making your real outputs. And One of the things that I recommend when doing that sort of hybrid life cycle is that you don't truly try to realize your design outputs until you have at least baselined the associated inputs for those outputs. You don't need to do all of your inputs, but those that are applying to those outputs, it's best practice to baseline them prior to making actual attempts to realize the outputs. And that's separate from, I discussed earlier, like doing technology prototyping and like a sort of phase zero outside of design controls activity. So if all you're doing is just making subassemblies to like try to figure out what is the best subassembly, what's the best way to drop this marble to do whatever, then that doesn't necessarily need to have baselined inputs prior to developing doing the technology development activities.
Okay. And so maybe a follow-up question on that would be, how do you handle a baselined input if you realize something needs to change? I mean, I guess it would be the same thing with change control or.
Yeah, generally they kind of follow. So it's once you've baselined, you're now saying, well, this is subject to change control. And it's not any more frozen than that. It's not, this can never change, which some people fear that and don't want to do design freeze or baselining. And it's, yeah, you can change it. Just now you have to do a little bit of extra documentation. And honestly, that's expected. And if you don't have that, then that may draw questions that they don't see changes in your inputs throughout your process.
Yeah. And they may, so that I've heard that term baselining quite a bit with project management, PMI. If you study the PMP, they use baselining all the time. You basically take a snapshot of your timeline and you know it's going to change, but now you can determine if you're ahead or as things change. So it's a kind of a similar concept, I think. Okay.
Yeah, and that's why NCOSI uses it, is because it's not just the inputs. It's also like, well, what does that mean for my schedule and my budget? Because the way that they view all of this is that it's all interrelated.
Yeah. No, when you mention, we could go into a whole conversation on this, I think, but for example, risk management as it applies to in a lot of different areas versus just the product. There's a lot of things in the medical device industry we sort of assume we're talking about when we talk, or you get very specific with our words, but other industries have a broader view, more umbrella term. Okay, but I'll stop talking here. Ed says, I know you've emphasized using design controls to add value, but you haven't detailed much about how we might make sure we are using those processes to add value. Could you discuss in more detail really what value we're adding or emphasizing, how we make sure people don't lose sight of making sure each of our design controls really do add value to our project and don't become checkbox activities?
Yeah, I mean, it's widely going to vary depending on what specifically you're doing within the design control space. I think that the value of good planning is kind of self-evident. If you try to go back and make a plan to just describe all the things you did, that's where it's obviously not adding value, because it's not a plan, it's just a summary. Things like design inputs, you want to make sure that you're focused on, am I truly capturing valid and real user needs? Am I truly capturing real functional requirements that tie to those user needs that I can then go test with? And a lot of this really just comes down to timing. If you're doing it early enough to inform your design process, it is inherently adding value. If you're doing it kind of as an afterthought, after the fact activity, it's inherently not going to add value. And so that's the thumb rule that I would use when you're approaching design controls and assessing, am I doing this in a way that adds value?
Okay. Chaya, if I'm saying your name correctly, apologies if not, asks, is architecture primarily something used in software devices?
I'll say that that's where it tends to add the most value, yes, is in some sort of electromechanical or software, either in or as medical device product. However, if you have a complex mechanical assembly with no software in it, it may still make sense to do architecture for it. If you have a tongue depressor, probably not. I wouldn't recommend doing a complex architecture, really any sort of detailed architecture documents for your tongue depressor.
Okay. And essentially, and I just want for my own sake, architecture, when you mention that, it's really, we're talking about the process flow diagram, or am I too simplified?
So it's views or models of structure and behavior. So if you want to discuss like the sequence of what happens within the device to perform certain activities. What are the allowable transitions between like device states? What are the allocations of components to subassemblies to the overall assembly? Outside of like, I'm building a structured bomb, like well before that, like figuring out what is the overall hierarchy of components within my device. Flow of substances or energy around the device are also useful to visualize through structural modeling. So there's a lot of different uses for structural, or for rather just modeling in general in architecture, and it's just going to apply to whatever is most useful for your device that you're developing.
Okay, so okay, that makes sense. And we'll ask a few more questions. There's actually a lot more questions coming in. If we don't get to all of the questions, just FYI, we will go ahead and we'll forward those questions on to Eric, and if he's able to answer them, that's fine. If we'll try to handle them in some way. I know there's a lot, so I'm not going to commit for him. I've done that in the past, and it's bitten me. So, RT, if I'm saying your name correctly, asked, how vital is usability testing, penetration testing, and cybersecurity testing for minor releases in software classified as a medical device?
It's kind of a loaded question. So generally, the FDA's stance on patching is if you're making a patch for safety or cybersecurity purposes, it is held to less rigorous standards than if you're making a patch for other reasons. The idea being kind of that you've done some sort of risk-benefit analysis and you don't foresee significant issues caused by this patch. You've done some sort of limited testing to show that the patch doesn't break everything. Recall, what was that? Wasn't Cloudflare. It was whatever one.
CrowdStrike.
CrowdStrike, yeah. Yeah. So don't do that. But beyond, if you've made sure that you're not going to, cause that sort of issue, that's generally the level of concern for like a cybersecurity or a safety patch, assuming that it's adding value in that way. If you're adding functionality, then they're more focused on things like doing, your full design control process with all your regression analysis and everything else for whatever functionality you're adding or whatever else. And as for usability testing, then that gets into IEC 62366 questions of, well, what critical tasks have you impacted? Have you impacted them in such a way that the risk profile of those critical tasks has changed? And well, now you need to go, do some sort of formative test to go prove that you haven't changed that usability model in any particular way. So like I said, it's a loaded question. There's a lot of answers to a lot of different variations on that question.
Okay. No, makes sense. That one, there's a lot there we could do. We can and have done full webinars on cybersecurity in the past. So if you're interested in that, let us know. We can maybe do some more in the future. Shai asked, this is a little bit less voted question, but I thought it was a good one. What's the difference between engineering evaluations and design verifications? Do engineering evaluations need protocols? What are they used for in design controls? When do they count, et cetera?
Yeah, so best practice is do engineering evaluations throughout your design process. I talked about using measurement in your design reviews. And one of the best ways to do that is to do some sort of, less formal than design verification, engineering evaluation activities to assess how well is this thing that you're putting together meeting your requirements. And so kind of the earlier you can do that, the better. As soon as you have something that would be even remotely capable of meeting your requirement, put together a simple protocol. You don't even have to release the protocol necessarily, and go execute and see how it does. You want to keep records that you're doing this and put those records within your design history file, but the level of formality does not need to reach what you would do for design verification for those sorts of activities.
Okay. Next question comes from, and we'll make this the last question. What would be the best strategy to adopt in case where there's a high level of design changes during the development of products, especially when there are changes made by suppliers of the raw materials or inputs used, et cetera?
Lots of use of change control. where you're making fundamental changes to design inputs and even scope and boundaries of the project, it's going to have a lot of ramifications downstream. And this is where you get into things of or differences between change control within design controls of what did this impact within my project itself and my design history file, and change control from more of like a project perspective of realizing, hey, this just blew up my timeline, this blew up my budget. I need to properly account for that and make sure that the person requesting this change is aware of it, signing off on it, pay for it. Because what you don't want to have to happen is that the expectation is that all of this is being done with the same resources and amount of time that you previously had. And all of a sudden, those design controls are looking really juicy to cut from your schedule. So I'm always defensive of resources and schedule for the reason of making sure that we don't feel pressured into making bad decisions.
I do want to follow up. I said that was the last question, but my own curiosity of what your position is on this is getting the best of me. But suppose you have in those design outputs, you have a product, just a subcomponent of the massive assembly, like a screw, and it's a McMaster car screw, but occasionally they change their procedures and you can't really get them. The supplier quality agreement's not really strong there. So you may have additional part numbers from other suppliers. How do you handle that with your bill of materials and your design control to handle multiple components?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So in general, if it's something critical beyond I need an M2 screw to hold a panel onto a frame, don't use McMaster car. Go to a dedicated screw vendor for that. Now, if you have something that's less critical and it's largely just cosmetic or whatever else, then sure, McMaster car can be a fine resource for that. You still need to control for it. You need to have appropriate supplier controls in place. So let's assume that McMaster car gives you valid COCs that would indicate to you that the part number did change. That may or may not be a good assumption. So you would hopefully have your supplier controls set up in such a way that you would detect that there is a change, which would then cause a non-conformance activity of this thing is not the thing that I ordered. You now have to then assess, well, it's McMaster car. This is all they're going to give me now, and go and figure out if this has any impact on your device. If it's cosmetic or not important in some way, and that's why you used McMaster car in the first place, the answer to that is probably no, but you still have to go through that activity and do that assessment. And if the answer is yes, well, then you have to figure out some other solution than continuing to use this screw that's different from the one you used previously.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciate it. Those of you who've been asking questions, you've asked some really good questions. I mean, I'm still a little, there's a lot of really good questions in the question and Q&A section. So really great work from everybody. We'll pass those on to Eric, and he can do something with them. We'll see. I don't know exactly what just yet, but those of you who've been asking about the recording and the slides, that will be coming to you in a follow-up email. So check your email, keep an eye out for that. We'll make sure we'll get that to you. And on behalf of Greenlight Guru, thank you all for attending today's webinar. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. Let's get back to it. Take care.
Thank you.